Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic ReCon, testimonies from reverts and converts. I'm your host, Eddie Trask. This week's guest is Joshua Yen. You need to check out his site, josh-yen.com. Joshua Yen is the founder of Logos Education and runs 3 YouTube channels, one of which is called Philosophy for All. So if you type that into YouTube, you will, I believe, find it quite fascinating what he works on there. He is currently an undergraduate at the University of Oxford, reading philosophy and theology. He is a published author of Christianity for All, the UCA's Bible, and more. In his free time, Joshua enjoys playing football, fishing, and supporting Chelsea Football Club. Joshua, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. It's great to speak to you.
Was there anything that I missed that you want to tell the audience about what you work on and how you even find time to be an undergraduate at Oxford and do these things?
Well, there's not much more to add to that. So you've given me a really brilliant introduction, and thank you for that. Not much really. I would say I do some of my research on 19th century theology, Dostoevsky, philosophy of religion, like The Problem of Evil, apologetics works. So if you are interested in that side of Christianity, I know a lot of people in the Christian circles are getting drawn to Dostoevsky through the works of Jordan Peterson and things like that. So, I mean, that's just something to keep your eye out, I suppose.
When are you expected to graduate?
2 years' time, yes. I'm currently in my second year, so my third term of my second year is almost finishing, and after third year, I graduate from uni.
Excellent. It's just great to see that you, again, I don't know how you find the time, but it's great to see that you're able to study and also get your face out there, get uh, some of the videos that I watched that you did. It's so important. Philosophically, yes, more than anything, more and more people that are willing to dialogue with charity. And I find that in you, and I find it refreshing. So I want to encourage you to keep doing that because you do a great job. Okay, so why don't we start with? Oftentimes we start with someone's childhood. In your case, that wasn't too long ago. No offense. That's a good thing. I think you've come a long way. You're very mature for your age. But if you could start at the beginning, that would be great.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share kind of my conversion experience for you. And I do hope it's probably edifying to your viewers. I grew up in a Christian family, a Protestant denomination, a Baptist denomination to be specific, back in Hong Kong. And I have to say, I'm not going to come out and be like, oh, I had this horrible Protestant upbringing. It's nothing like that. I have wonderful parents who I really love, and they really grew me up. They rose me in a church with a real emphasis on the scriptures, a real emphasis on a love for God, and I would say those things were wonderful. I don't look back on that and be like, oh, that was horrible. I dislike these things. I really loved it. But then over time, through high school, my faith kind of went up and down. I got baptized when I was 15, and some things happened which drew me closer to the faith at times. Some experiences and some other things drew me away from the faith. I was in a relationship with this girl. Some things happened, of course, as hormones are high, you get drawn away from the faith. And then some things also drew me back to stronger in a relationship with Christ. And actually, that was somewhat unfortunately due to a relationship with a Catholic who I felt was not really presenting his faith very well. He was saying, oh, I'm a Catholic, I'm this altar boy at the church, but at the same time, I felt he was living a very prideful, arrogant life, through which my own self-reflection noticed, well, I was living quite a horrible life. So that drew me back closer to my relationship with Christ. So then I kind of came into Oxford with quite a strong anti-Catholic tendency, unfortunately. That experience with Catholicism, I think, even not in its truest form, really kind of shook me. And I was like, well, how does the role of ritual of I suppose this hierarchical structure kind of tie in to one's direct relationship with God? And of course, Dostoevsky's kind of objection in the Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov, where he says, well, the Catholic Church has gotten rid of all forms of human freedom and replaced it with a church which forces belief in mystery onto human beings, that became a very strong part of my religious consciousness. So I came into Oxford around 2 years ago with a very strong kind of anti-Catholic tendency. I wouldn't necessarily say that I really disliked Christ at the time, but it was very much based on the anti-Catholic tendency that I stepped into Oxford. And I would say that was kind of my childhood leading up to my university life. I mean, I don't know where the boundaries of childhood lie. I'm
No,
only
no, no,
20
that
after all, but I would suppose that's kind of it.
you got us to within a few years here. So was there a class that you took that piqued your interest, that started to shift things? Did you read something from John Henry Newman? What was, I guess, the first point? I know for many people it's a series of steps. It is certainly not something that happens at once. So for you, what do you think started to break down the anti-Catholic vantage point that you had?
Hmm. I would say there's two main things, and one of them is what you noted previously, dialogues with charity. I was looking for a church when I first came to Oxford. I went to a few of the Anglican services, a few of the Protestant services, some Anglican, Methodist, Baptist kind of services, and I just didn't feel very at home there. And during that time, one of my fellow freshers or freshmen, as I suppose you call it over in the States, would said, "Oh, do you want to attend a Catholic mass with me?" So I said, "Okay, sure. That sounds interesting." I pop over, and then I was like, "Okay, this is a very different experience of worship. Of course, it's a bit more similar to high Anglican
Yes.
services, but nonetheless, it was way more structured. I felt there's something different here. There's a lot of reverence. I took in the form of ritual. I saw how people would kneel in certain parts of the liturgy. This was Novus Ordo, a mass to begin with. And then after that, I was like, okay, this is quite interesting. I probably should attend again. And then the next day, or the next week, they said, well, oh, let's attend this other Catholic mass at the Oxford Oratory, which, fun fact, is where J.R. Tolkien used to worship. And so me as a Lord of the Rings fan, was like, oh, that's pretty cool. I probably should pop over. And I went there. They do this beautiful Novus Ordo, but in Latin, which was quite cool. I did like it a lot, and I felt, okay, this is something very, very special. And so I started getting very fascinated with the mass and what does the mass symbolize. And during this time, also, I love football, soccer. So I love playing soccer. And I met some Catholics who do play soccer around Oxford. And I was like, okay, I started playing soccer with them, and I met a lot of wonderful Catholics there. And we started having these debates and discussions about Catholicism and Protestantism and some of the structural kind of reasons or evidence for why Catholicism might be true or why Protestantism might be true. And we had these long debates in pubs until like late at night. And over time, I slowly, over the course of a year, really developed an appreciation for Catholicism and discovered the truth of Catholicism, at least in my estimation.
Were those friends quite calm in the way that they were defending the faith? Did that have any part in you saying, you know what, I think I'm going to continue down this path and research further? How did that play out? Because I know it can be contentious, even among friends, which can be actually, that can be quite rewarding too, depending on what your personality is. But how was it for you and your friends?
Hmm. I would say it was very, very charitable. It wasn't any form of anger or criticism. I think there is a very big difference in dialogue between personal attacks against someone and strong constructive criticism of
Yes.
each other's arguments. And one of the brilliant things about Catholic Oxford, and I would say most Oxford students in general, is that ability to separate the two, to say, well, all right, I really respect and love you as a person, but I think your arguments are absolutely horrible. So there was kind of that dialogue that we had, and I would be providing some of my arguments. Some of their arguments would kind of make me reflect on things. And I think this general openness to be criticized and also to criticize other people's arguments was something which really helped. So it would help me develop my understanding of Catholicism and understanding their understanding of Catholicism as well. Because in some sense, although we do like to view humans as part of this worldview, we have a human here and then a worldview of Catholicism or Protestantism or whatnot on the other side and try to draw a line. That only works so far as you talking to an individual person to understand that what they're believing and their approach of things is vastly different from each other. That's not to say Catholicism is different for a million different people. There is one true church. But to say the approaches and the spirituality and expression of that Catholicism within each person's life is vastly different. So by understanding each different person's perspective, that really helped me kind of develop my own approach to Catholicism and formed my own kind of intellectual journey towards the faith.
Did you ask them about resources to go to, or did you just say, okay, that's a good point, and then you just did your own research independent of what they were potentially suggesting?
I liked to do the latter, to kind of interact with them, do a bit of my research on these topics that we were discussing. Then we'll come back and talk more about it or have more discussions on it. Though at the same time, I kind of set myself an interesting rule. I said to myself, probably don't do too much reading into this subject. I like doing a lot of reading into a lot of other subjects, but I was like, well, my approach is to say, well, faith to me is not something which one should need uh a deep theological degree to actually get right. It's not something where someone needs to approach and say, I have to have read all of St. Aquinas's works or all of these works written in literature, but rather to say, well, everyone can come to Christ given reason and understanding of the world that he has given to us. And from that, I thought, well, okay, I should look at this whole debate about Catholicism, Protestantism, and whatnot from a purely structural level and just see what kind of convinced my senses the most by understanding the history of the church by looking at some of these evidence. And of course, that would require some reading. But nonetheless, I didn't want I suppose, my decision to be dictated by a form of apologetics book for Catholicism or an apologetics book for Protestantism, but rather to just look at kind of the history, look at some of the arguments within the scriptures, and then just say, well, all right, see what convinces me most at the end of the day.
Okay, so then what was it that it's one thing to go down a path, but there's that ultimate moment in many cases where the final stake is placed and the light bulb finally, I guess for the last time in a weird way,
Mm.
goes off and you say, I need to join this church. Do you remember
Mm.
a specific moment like that?
Yes, I think the specific moment, it kind of has to be viewed in context of a broader context. So after I started going to Catholic Mass weekly, and after I started attending adoration at this Opus Dei group at in Oxford called Grandpont, I started really appreciating and adoring the Eucharist, and from that kind of respect towards the Eucharist and the belief in the real presence in the Eucharist at Mass and at adoration, I started to really have that feeling of awe and respect for Christianity, which really drew me closer to Catholicism. But at the same time, there was a lot of things at the back of my head, kind of like questions of doctrine, questions of these small doctrinal issues, doctrinal debates, and I was talking to my friend saying, well, this is all is very good. I want to be Catholic. I really do, but I want to be taking part in the sacraments because I believe the sacramental life is something which is very beautiful. But then I was like, there's so much doctrine and stuff in the church all the time that I can't be perfect. I don't think I can be perfect when it comes to all of this. And then she said something which I have to admit is rather un-Catholic, but nonetheless, it's not always about doctrine. And I was like, and it didn't really sit into my head, or I didn't like kind of click that at that present moment. But then the next day, I was at mass and I was praying before the Eucharistic rite, and all of a sudden those words came into my head. It's not always about doctrine. And I was like, oh, this is odd. It felt like a very spiritual experience. I wouldn't say I'm very much of a superstitious person. I definitely don't go look for miracles and everything. But nonetheless, I was like, okay, this is crazy to have like the voice, almost like a very active voice speaking into my head during mass. I was like, okay, that's quite interesting. And I reflected upon the idea of it's not about doctrine more. And I was like, well, that's kind of right. I mean, yes, doctrine is very important. And we have, of course, key dogma, which is the foundation of the church, the Nicene creeds, things like that, which represent the core of the church. But there's a lot of other things which most people don't really, it doesn't really make up the fullness of the faith in some sense. You have the sacraments, that's the life. You have the Nicene Creed, which is the dogmatic center of the faith. But when it comes to saying, oh, someone has to get to understand absolutely every single doctrine which was ever written by every
Yes.
part of the church, that's not the emphasis of the Catholic faith. And if someone were to be judged on that by Christ, then well, I suppose everyone ought to be taking a master's or PhD in philosophy or theology to try to get that done, which is not really the case. I mean, the best example of faith to me is the elderly grandmother who comes to church and prays, or the elderly grandfather who comes to church to pray. And to me, that kind of represents the simplicity but the beauty of the faith. And they don't really care about all the doctrine. If I asked them what happened at Chalcedon, they probably wouldn't tell me what happened at Chalcedon. But their respect and love and their relationship with Christ is the most important thing. And as a result, that kind of made me think, okay, maybe my approach to this is wrong. Maybe my existential dread in this kind of aspect is wrong, and I should convert to Catholicism.
That's very smart. I'll just leave it there. Very smart, because there are a lot of people that I've spoken to on this show and elsewhere that ended up in that cycle of, I need to understand everything, but I feel very limited just by the way I was made. Like, people can admit that we all have barriers intellectually. I have to admit that all the time. But they would come to that limitation and get frustrated because they're saying, I need to know. They sense that there is truth at the end of this road, and yet they're hitting these blockades. And what you're describing is, now we do in the church, we need scholars. We need people in certain places for a very specific reason based on their talents. But there are those that have been converting to the faith for centuries based on simple faith, on their simple faith. So the fact that you discovered that, while at the same time not discounting everything that you've learned and are able to speak about, fantastic. Okay, so do you remember your first mass? I'm assuming you joined RCIA soon after this. What
Hmm.
is that like in England as an experience? And if you can speak just to that period of time a little bit, that'd be great.
So I would say RCIA in England. I did it at the Oxford Oratory. I'm not sure what they called it RCIA, but it was essentially RCIA. So what they had was they had a class of I think it was like 6 or 7 people, and each Thursday we'll come together and talk about one aspect of the Catholic faith. We started following the Nicene Creed. Actually, we started off with, I believe in God the Father. What does that mean? What do we mean by the Trinity? What do we mean by the Virgin Mary who conceived Christ? What do we mean by that? What do we mean of the Holy Spirit, which of course was part of the Trinity? Then we believed in what was the one holy apostolic Catholic Church. What's that? So we kind of worked through the Nicene Creed slowly together, and I felt it was absolutely fascinating to really understand more of Catholicism. And I think that is something which all of Christianity could help or learn from, because although in the past you have this very strong emphasis on catechesis, which was even maintained within the Lutheran tradition, in the modern day, a lot of Protestants don't really have catechesis, or at least to the extent that
Sure.
Catholics do. And as a result, there seems to be a bit of a intellectual divide between the two kind of groups or denominations, if one can place it at that. Though at the same time, I do have to say, a lot of times there's a wide mix of RCIAs out there. For example, there's some RCIAs which are a bit less intellectual and more on kind of the spiritual side, and some are more on the intellectual side and less on the spiritual side. I'll say my experience was on the latter. So it really depends on kind of what the individual is looking for, and also kind of what they think is perhaps best for them in their development with Christ.
Yes. Okay. So how long was that period?
Mm. It was around 1 month, well, three or 3 months and a half, though that would be split over a period of 2 months and a half, just because how Oxford terms work. We were
Okay.
in Oxford for 2 weeks, no, 2 months, out for 2 months, and then back in for another 2 months. So it kind of lasted the first term of 2 months, and then halfway through the second term.
Now, you may have said it briefly at the beginning. You were baptized or you were not as a youngin, were you?
Hmm. I was baptized as a youngin
Okay.
when I was 15, and then I got confirmed into the church
Okay.
when I
Excellent.
was, yeah, recently.
Recently. Okay. And what about confession? Do you remember your first confession when that occurred? Because I know that's a pretty dramatic shift for someone raised Protestant.
Hmm. I remember my first confession. It was, I think, a day before my confirmation. I was like, okay, should I do it on the day of my confirmation? But then my father said, well, the chance of you committing mortal sin between 11 a.m. the day before and the actual confirmation 11 a.m. the next day is quite low. So if that does happen, then do come to mass the morning before and have a confession then. But unless that happens, it should be good. So I have my confession on the day before I was confirmed, and I felt it was such a freeing experience. In fact, one of the surprising things of my conversion was I was never really in doubt of any of the sacraments. I was like, well, all of these make very, very good sense to have confession to help you achieve that state of perfect contrition, which is often quite difficult to do when you don't have to actually confess it and confront that difficulty of confession. Having a sacrament of confession is something which is very, very helpful. Likewise, the things like baptism, whatnot, are also very kind of self-evident, confirmation and the Eucharist. But speaking more specifically to confession, I remember I was struggling to kind of figure out how many sins I committed, and but that's why it's, I suppose, a general absolution. So it's a bit more kind of general in that sense. But it was very freeing to be able to understand, or at least accept the fact that I've made a perfect contrition and that all my sins have been forgiven. You have that peace within you. I mean, contrary to what a lot of Protestants say by saying, oh, if you are justified by faith, accept sola fide, then, and you also accept once saved, always saved, then you can be very calm and assured of your salvation, and you could be very assured of the fact that your sins are forgiven. Well, that argument only goes so far as human conscience, because when you look at human conscience, it tells us that, well, all right, you've committed this great sin. As much as you want to tell yourself, oh, God's going to forgive me, if all you've done for that is to say, well, oh, God, I'm really sorry for this sin, privately and in your own room and without any kind of sacrament of confession out there, you don't get that reassurance very strongly, no matter how much you believe in sola fide and what not. But with the sacrament of confession, you actually do get that fullness of an absolution, and you can understand with full confidence that your sins have been forgiven, and you don't need to worry about it. And I did notice a really massive psychological change before and after my first confession. A lot of things which I feel was being used to tempt me by Satan and the devils was always in my mind. A few things that I've done previously to the confession were just always plaguing my mind. And after that, I was like, look, that's not within me anymore. I'm not going to be held accountable for such things. And that absolution was a real strength and source of peace.
That's beautiful. You brought it to light, and so many temptations just end in those moments. That's so great. So you mentioned that you had been going to adoration, and what was that like now, being able, first reception of the Holy Eucharist? Based on the fact that we're discussing the sacraments like this, I'd love to know if you remember the emotions behind that. And second part of that question is, do you remember what you realized about transubstantiation in your research that caused that? Whoa, whoa. Was it John 6? Was it early church fathers? What was it that made that all come together for you?
So, as to the feelings when I first received the Eucharist, it was a deep sense of peace, a deep sense of beauty, and to say I've finally kind of made that step into the fullness of the Christian faith. And that sense of peace was not as, it wasn't some sense of like, oh, thunders and lightning and trumpets and fanfare. It was just this kind of very slow peace and this almost the feeling of being absorbed into the love of Christ. And adoration's perhaps the best example of that. When you just sit there, you don't really do much. I mean, of course, you sing some hymns, or you sing some chants, and you adore the Eucharist. But I felt a lot of times I would just sit there or kneel there in front of the Eucharist and just pray and look at it and gaze upon it. And that was something which, I suppose, that separation only made me want to be part of the fullness and take part in the Eucharist even more. But that peace which I got from being in front of Christ carried on into my first communion, and that kind of has been so ever since. And I've really been appreciating that. And I do view that kind of adoration for the Eucharist as kind of the heart of my faith, is always going back to the Eucharist and always the real presence of Christ. That's something which really touched my heart. And I suppose that ties into the second question of transubstantiation, about, well, how did I know that was the case? And to me, it really was, I suppose, an emphasis on the real presence within the scriptures of, this is my body as said in the Mass, and this is my blood. But more notably than that, it just felt to me to be evidently true that there was something different about being in the presence of the Eucharist, or being in the presence of the Eucharist in adoration or in the Mass. There's just something so evidently true, which I didn't need much convincing that the real presence was actually in the monstrance or whatnot. I was just sat there, I was kneeling there, and I was like, well, that just seems like something evidently true to say. Well, God has allowed, is really present there, because I just felt so much love and so much peace and so much beauty in it. And I mean, it's somewhat inexplicable, but I do, and I suppose William James would call it a mysterium tremendum et fascinans. Or is that Otto? I can't remember, but nonetheless, it's this mysterious and tremendous experience. But I would like to encourage any Protestant to kind of just try to do that, to really go to a Catholic service or adoration, and you just kneel there and pray and try to see what that gives you. And to me, it gave me a great sense of peace and a great sense of love, which
Wow.
made transubstantiation evidently true to me above all form of reasoning.
That's incredible. You're describing something which obviously transcends it all. But for you to not, what you're describing is so different than so many people that I've spoken to. And it corresponds to what you said earlier about the simple faith. For you to have that realization is such a tremendous grace. For you to not necessarily, hey, I'm going to go to the Greek translation here, and I'm going to keep digging in. And not to say there's not a place for that, but in your case, I'm shocked that I've not heard what you just said from other people, that you just said evidently true, manifestly true, and to instead ask Protestant brothers and sisters to attend,
Hmm.
rather than necessarily say, let's go to John 6 together.
Hmm.
I don't know how often that necessarily works, but in any instance, through prayer, and like I said before, through tremendous grace, for you to be able to recognize that reality is something that I love it. I love hearing it. Okay, so can you speak to, after this was all happening, first of all, did you have any friends along for the ride with you that were part of those debates when you first came to Oxford?
I had a lot of friends who kind of I'm still really, really close with. All of these are Catholic friends. I don't
Yeah.
actually have much friends in the Protestant community, not because I've fallen out with them. That's not what's happened. I just never really got along very well with the Protestant community. So I mean, as a result, I mainly am around Catholic Oxford. That's basically my major social group. But I
Yeah.
mean, they've been absolutely wonderful. And if any of my friends are watching this, huge shout out to you lot. You know who you are. But I mean, they've been amazing. That's really all I
That's
could
great.
say. And
That's great. No. Okay. So then what you're doing on YouTube across 3 channels, what is the aim of the ministry, if I may call it that?
mm.
Yeah.
The ministry is to really demonstrate that simple faith. I think to be able to show how, of course, you can have that intellectual side, which I do try to bring across in the channel, but to also emphasize through personal stories and the way I try to live my life, to say that sometimes that scholarly life is not everything. I want to make things simple, to share people's experiences of coming to God, and also share my own walk with God as well. I think you could see quite, which was a wonderful thing from the very start of my philosophy channel, where I think I made a video, one of my earlier videos 3-4 years ago, was, oh, why sola scriptura is correct and why this Catholic
Wow.
truth person's argument's wrong. And quite funnily, 3 years later now, down the line, I'm now talking to Catholic Truth on his channel and talking about why I've become a Catholic. So I think in some sense it is almost as much a documentation of my own journey in faith as it is hopefully a sign to other people to say, well, these are some of the helpful things in philosophy and theology that you can learn from, but also to say, well, that's not the only part of faith, and that simple faith is also a very important part of it as well.
Did you leave that video up?
Yes, it's still there, I think.
Great.
Probably should still be there.
It should be there.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think you do what you want. I think those two videos, or any two videos that show the old and the new, should be linked so that you say, hey, what you thought was foundational and absolutely crucial, you did a lot of research, and over the years you're going to detail that. I know it, and I've actually seen it in some of your videos. You're starting to detail everything that you've learned over the past few years, and then to show, here I am, and here are the differences between what I was thinking then, what I know to be true now. And I know it would help a lot of people to see that growth, I guess, in your ability to challenge your own presuppositions and do the research, but at the same time have that nice balance where you can show forth this simple faith. So anything else you want to add, Joshua?
I don't think there's much more to add to that. I think the emphasis on the simple faith is just the most beautiful thing. Taking it back to the basics of the sacrament, the real presence of Christ too, when going to Mass, to really appreciate the fact that we are in the presence of Christ. And that to me is just the fullness of the faith. It means everything to all of us Catholics, and it should mean everything to everyone around the world as well. So emphasizing on that simple faith, to emphasize on that love and real presence of Christ to our fellow Protestant brothers and sisters, I think is the key.
It's great. Well, I want to thank you for your work. I want to thank you for taking time. And I wish you the best in your continued studies and all the work that you're going to continue to do. And God bless you and your family.
Thank you. God bless you and your community here.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for watching. Until next time, take care and God bless. Bye.